Imagine a world where William Shakespeare wrote a play that simply disappeared after being performed. Picture the Roman Emperor Claudius, often seen as bumbling, penning his own life story only for it to vanish. Think about Aristotle, the great philosopher, writing a whole book on what makes us laugh. A book that might have changed comedy forever, now lost. And consider this. A book mentioned right in the pages of the Old Testament, the book of the wars of the Lord, is nowhere to be found. Entire libraries of Mayan history, thousands of years of knowledge, went up in smoke. These aren't plot lines from movies. They're real stories of incredibly influential books that history somehow misplaced, erased, or destroyed. Number 14. The Unseen Universe of Democritus. Democritus, the ancient Greek philosopher from Abdera, active around 460 BC, wasn't just the laughing philosopher because he found life amusing. He was profoundly engaged with understanding its deepest structures. He, along with his teacher Leucippus, pioneered atomism, the revolutionary idea that all matter consists of an infinite number of tiny, indivisible, and indestructible particles called atoms, constantly moving in an infinite void. This was a radical departure from other contemporary theories. Ancient bibliographers like Diogenes Laertius credit Democritus with an enormous body of work, possibly over 70 treatises. These weren't just philosophical musings. They spanned an encyclopedic range. Imagine titles like The Great World System, On the Planets, On the Nature of Man, On Mind, On Senses, On Flavors, On Colors, Ethical Writings, On Geometry, Numbers, On Music, On Poetry, Causes of Celestial Phenomena, Causes of Terrestrial Phenomena, On Agriculture, On Painting, Tactics, and Fighting in Armor. This list, though likely not exhaustive, paints a picture of a mind exploring nearly every facet of knowledge available at the time. So, what happened to this treasure trove of ancient science and philosophy? The bulk of his writings disappeared, likely during the intellectual bottleneck of the early Middle Ages. Some historians suggest that his materialistic worldview, which didn't easily accommodate divine intervention or an immortal soul in the traditional sense, made his works less palatable for preservation by later Christian and Neoplatonist scholars. Others point to the sheer fragility of papyrus scrolls and the general decline in the copying and study of such specialized texts. We know his atomic theory primarily because Aristotle, a staunch critic of atomism, discussed it at length, often to refute it. And later Epicurus adopted and adapted atomism, with his school preserving some of these ideas. These are echoes. What mathematical proofs did Democritus devise? What were his detailed observations on biology or meteorology? What were the nuances of his ethical system that advocated for cheerfulness, euthymia, as the highest good? The loss of his original texts means we have only a fragmented understanding of one of antiquity's most versatile and forward-thinking intellects, a man whose ideas about atoms were astonishingly prescient. The full scope of his unseen universe remains largely unseen by us. Number 13. The Lost Cosmic Tales of Pherecydes of Syros. Living in the 6th century BC, Pherecydes of Syros stands as a pivotal, yet enigmatic figure in the dawn of Greek philosophy. He's often hailed as one of the very first Greeks to write down his philosophical and cosmological thoughts in prose, a significant shift from the epic poetry of Homer and Hesiod, which had traditionally conveyed such grand narratives. This move to prose allowed for a different kind of precision and argumentation. His primary work, often referred to by later writers as the Heptamychos, meaning 7 sanctuaries or 7 ereses, or sometimes theogony or Phetamychos, is now entirely lost except for scattered fragments and summaries. This book reportedly offered a unique creation story, Distinct from the more famous Olympian myths, Pherecydes proposed an eternal trinity of divine principles: Zas, life or Zeus; Chronos, time; and Kai Phoni, earth or underworld. The narrative supposedly involved Chronos creating the cosmos from his own seed, and a great cosmic battle between Chronos and Ophionius, a serpent-like deity, for dominion over the universe. Zas was said to have woven a magnificently embroidered robe for Chathani, depicting earth and ocean as a wedding gift when she became Earth. Ancient tradition, including accounts from Aristotle and Cicero, names Pherecydes as a teacher of Pythagoras, the famed mathematician and philosopher associated with the doctrine of transmigration of souls and the harmony of the spheres. If this connection is accurate, Pherecydes' ideas on the soul, he was one of the first to teach its immortality, and the cosmos could have profoundly shaped Pythagoreanism, and through it, Plato and the entire Western philosophical tradition. What specific doctrines did Pherecydes elaborate on regarding the soul's journey? How did his allegorical cosmology explain the structure and workings of the universe in detail? The surviving fragments are tantalizingly brief. We are missing his direct voice, his pioneering prose that sought to explain the deepest mysteries. The loss of the Heptamychos obscures our view of this crucial transitional period when mythic thought was beginning to transform into philosophical inquiry, leaving us to guess at the full texture of his innovative worldview. Number 12. The Emperor's Own Story. Claudius's autobiography. Emperor Claudius, who unexpectedly took the Roman throne in 41 AD after the assassination of Caligula and ruled until 54 AD, is a figure often viewed through the somewhat critical lens of historians like Suetonius and Tacitus. They painted him as physically frail, plagued by a limp and a stutter, at times indecisive or manipulated by his wives and freedmen, though also acknowledging his scholarly pursuits. But Claudius himself put pen to papyrus to offer his own version of his life and times. This extensive autobiography, sadly, has not survived. The historian Suetonius, in his biography, The Deified Claudius, explicitly states that Claudius composed a history of his own life in 8 books, written with more candor than elegance. Suetonius also notes that Claudius began this work during the reign of Augustus, and continued it later. Given Claudius's unique position, an often overlooked member of the imperial family who observed the reigns of Augustus, Tiberius, and his nephew Caligula from within the palace walls, his personal account would have been invaluable. Think about what this lost work might have contained. Claudius had access to private conversations, family secrets, and the inner workings of imperial power that few could ever witness. How did he truly perceive Augustus, the founder of the Principate? What were his unvarnished opinions of the paranoid Tiberius, or the erratic Caligula? He could have shed light on the complex dynamics of the Julio-Claudian family, their ambitions, fears, and the brutal politics that often led to exile or death. His account of his sudden chaotic ascension to power, when the Praetorian Guard found him hiding behind a curtain and proclaimed him emperor, would have been fascinating. Beyond court intrigue, Claudius was a genuine scholar. He wrote a lost history of the Etruscans in 20 books, and a history of Carthage in 8 books, and even devised new letters for the Latin alphabet. His autobiography would likely have reflected this intellectual depth, offering not just personal anecdotes, but perhaps reasoned analyses of policies and events. Its loss means we are largely reliant on secondary sources for our understanding of Claudius, sources that may have been biased or lacked his intimate perspective. His own voice, defending his actions, explaining his motivations, and chronicling one of Rome's most dramatic eras from the inside, is now silent. Number 11. The Burned Songs of Sappho. Sappho, the ancient Greek poet from the island of Lesbos, lived around 600 BC. She was so famous in antiquity that Plato reportedly called her the 10th Muse. Her poetry, written in her native Aeolic dialect, was celebrated for its beauty, emotional intensity, and exploration of love, desire, and relationships, particularly among women. She ran a kind of academy for young women, teaching them music and poetry. Ancient sources tell us that her collected works filled 9 papyrus scrolls in the Library of Alexandria. Imagine 9 whole books of exquisitely crafted verse, lyrical outpourings that moved her contemporaries to awe. These would have contained hymns to gods and goddesses, wedding songs, and intensely personal poems. She was an innovator in meter, even having a specific stanza form, the Sapphic stanza, named after her. So where did all this poetry go? Tragically, very little of Sappho's work survives today. We have one complete poem, the Ode to Aphrodite, and numerous fragments, some just a single word, others a few haunting lines. These fragments have been painstakingly recovered from scraps of papyrus used to wrap mummies in Egypt, pieces of ancient pottery, or quotes in the works of other ancient writers. The reasons for the loss are debated. The fragile nature of papyrus scrolls over millennia is one factor. Another, more troubling theory suggests deliberate destruction. Centuries later, some church figures, like Gregory of Nazianzus in the 4th century AD, are said to have ordered the burning of her books because of her erotic themes, particularly those depicting love between women, which were deemed inappropriate or immoral by later sensibilities. While direct evidence for widespread systematic burning is scarce, societal disapproval and neglect could have had the same effect, leading to fewer copies being made and preserved. Whatever the exact cause, the result is a profound literary loss. We have glimpses of her genius enough to understand why she was so revered, but the vast majority of her songs, her insights into the human heart, her depictions of female community and affection in ancient Greece, are gone. It's like knowing of a brilliant composer, but only having a few bars of their most famous symphonies. Number 10. The Secrets of Laughter. Aristotle's second book of Poetics. Aristotle, the towering Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC, wrote a foundational work on literary theory called Poetics. The first book, which thankfully survives, analyzes tragedy. In it, Aristotle systematically dissects what makes a tragic play effective, discussing concepts like plot, character, catharsis, and mimesis, imitation. It's a cornerstone of Western literary criticism. But here's the kicker. Aristotle himself, in the Poetics and other works, like the Rhetoric, refers to a second part of Poetics that would deal with comedy. He even mentions that he will discuss iambic poetry and humor there. This lost second book is one of the most tantalizing phantoms in literary history. Imagine a treatise by one of history's greatest minds, dedicated entirely to understanding what makes us laugh. What could it have contained? Based on how he treated tragedy, Aristotle likely would have defined comedy, classified its different types, discussed its origins, and analyzed its structural elements. He might have explored the nature of the ridiculous, the function of humor in society, and the psychological effects of laughter, perhaps a comic equivalent of tragic catharsis. Did he discuss satire, farce, irony, and wordplay? Who did he consider the masters of comedy? And why? Theories about its disappearance abound. Perhaps it was simply lost to the ravages of time, like so many other ancient texts, through neglect, fire, or the decay of materials. Some have speculated it was suppressed because laughter and satire could be seen as subversive. The famous novel and film, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, even spins a thrilling fictional tale around a monastic conspiracy to hide this very book, believing its power to be dangerous. Without this second book, Our understanding of classical aesthetics and Aristotle's complete literary theory is incomplete. We have his profound insights into tears, but his equally systematic thoughts on laughter are silent. It's a huge gap. How different would the history of comedy, humor theory, and even literary criticism be if this seminal work had survived? It's a question that has intrigued scholars for centuries. Number 9. The Vanished Play. Shakespeare's Cardenio. William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon, the most famous playwright in the English language. We know his 38 or so surviving plays intimately. But what if there was another one, Cumber, written by him, performed for royalty, and then just gone? That's the story of the history of Cardenio, often referred to simply as Cardenio. Court records from 1612 to 1613 show that the King's Men, Shakespeare's acting company, performed a play called Cardenio or Cardena twice before King James I. A stationer's register entry from 1653 lists the history of Cardenio by Mr. Fletcher and Shakespeare for publication, though no printed copy from that time has ever been found. John Fletcher was a frequent collaborator with Shakespeare in his later career, working together on plays like Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen. Character of Cardenio comes from an episode in Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, specifically Part 1, published in English translation in 1612. This Cardenio is a young nobleman driven to madness by love and betrayal. The timing fits perfectly for Shakespeare and Fletcher to have adapted this popular new story for the stage. So, what happened to it? This is where the mystery deepens. No manuscript or printed version from the 17th century survives. However, in 1727, the writer Louis Theobald staged a play called Double Falsehood, or The Distressed Lovers, which he claimed was adapted from 3 original manuscript copies of an unnamed Shakespeare play he had acquired. He suggested this lost play was Cardenio. Theobald's Double Falsehood does indeed feature characters and plot elements very similar to the Cardenio story in Don Quixote. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Double Falsehood genuinely preserves parts of the lost Cardenio, or if Theobald fabricated the Shakespearean connection. Modern stylistic analysis and historical research increasingly suggest that Double Falsehood likely does contain genuine material from Shakespeare and Fletcher. But the original Cardenio, as Shakespeare and Fletcher wrote it, and as it was performed for King James I, remains lost. Imagine having another work from the height of Shakespeare's powers, his take on Cervantes' tragicomic world. What unique poetry, what dramatic insights, what character developments did it contain that Theobald's adaptation might have altered or omitted? It's a ghost in Shakespeare's canon, a tantalizing glimpse of a collaboration we can no longer fully experience. Number 8. The Smoke and Ash of Mayan Knowledge. The Lost Codices. The Maya civilization, flourishing for centuries in Mesoamerica, developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. They recorded their history, astronomy, rituals, prophecies, and mythology in stunningly illustrated books called codices. These were made from the inner bark of fig trees, coated with a fine stucco, and folded like concertinas. Imagine libraries filled with these vibrant records, chronicling generations of astronomical observations, precise enough to predict eclipses, detailing complex religious ceremonies, and narrating the dynastic histories of their city-states. These codices were the repositories of Maya knowledge, wisdom, and culture, accumulated over hundreds, if not thousands of years. Then came the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. Along with soldiers, came zealous missionaries who viewed Maya religion as paganism and devil worship. One figure stands out: Bishop Diego de Landa. In July 1562, at Mani in the Yucatan Peninsula, Landa conducted a notorious auto de fe, a public act of penance. During this event, he ordered the destruction of a vast number of Maya codices and cult images. Landa himself wrote, "We found a large number of books in these characters, and, as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction." This single act, and others like it, resulted in an immeasurable cultural catastrophe. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, the intricate details of a rich civilization, went up in smoke. Only 4, or arguably 3 as one is disputed, Mayan codices are known to have survived this period, likely because they were sent to Europe as curiosities before the widespread destruction. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. Its authenticities is debated by some. These few survivors give us incredible insights into Maya, mathematics, astronomy, and ritual, but they represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. What did the lost codices contain? Detailed local histories, specific prophecies, unique mythological variations, scientific knowledge we can only guess at. The burning of the Mayan codices is a stark reminder of how quickly and tragically vast stores of human knowledge can be wiped out, leaving gaping holes in our understanding of the past. Number 7. The original blueprint of the Gospels, the Q source. When you read the Gospels of Matthew and Luke in the New Testament, you might notice that they share a lot of material, often word for word, that isn't found in the Gospel of Mark. This includes many famous sayings of Jesus like the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and parables such as the lost sheep and the faithful servant. Mark, generally considered the earliest gospel, doesn't have these. This puzzle led biblical scholars in the 19th century to propose the two-source hypothesis. This theory suggests that Matthew and Luke independently used 2 primary sources when writing their Gospels: the Gospel of Mark, for the narrative framework in many stories, and another, now lost source consisting mostly of sayings of Jesus. This hypothetical lost document is called the Q source, from the German word Quell, meaning source. No actual copy of Q has ever been found. It's a purely theoretical document, reconstructed by scholars by carefully comparing the texts of Matthew and Luke and identifying the material they have in common that is not in Mark. This shared material amounts to over 200 verses. What would Q have looked like? Scholars believe it was primarily a collection of Jesus' teachings, parables, and prophecies, with very little narrative content. It might have been a sort of sayings gospel, similar in some ways to the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, which is also largely a collection of sayings. It likely circulated in Greek in the early Christian communities around the mid-1st century AD, possibly even before Mark was written. The existence of Q, if true, would offer profound insights into the very earliest stages of the Jesus movement. It would represent a collection of teachings that early followers considered incredibly important, perhaps even more so than the narrative of Jesus' life at that initial stage. It would be a window into how Jesus' message was first remembered, preserved, and transmitted before the more structured narrative Gospels took shape. The fact that such a foundational document for 2 canonical Gospels is lost is remarkable. Why did it disappear? Perhaps once its contents were incorporated into the more comprehensive Gospels of Matthew and Luke, it was seen as redundant and gradually fell out of use, no longer copied and eventually vanishing. While its text is hypothetically reconstructed, the actual physical Q document, if it existed, remains one of Christianity's most significant lost texts. Number 6. The Unread Secrets of a Royal Rogue, Lord Byron's Memoirs. Lord Byron, the famous Romantic poet, was as notorious for his scandalous life as he was celebrated for his poetry. Affairs, debts, incest rumors, and a rebellious spirit made him a legend in his own time. Imagine, then, if he wrote his memoirs, a no-holds-barred account of his wild life and controversial opinions. He did. And they were deliberately burned. Between 1818 and 1821, Byron composed his memoirs, filling 2 volumes. He entrusted the manuscript to his friend, the Irish poet Thomas Moore, intending for it to be published after his death. Byron himself seemed to relish the thought of the posthumous shockwaves it would create, writing that it contained many opinions and some fun, with a detailed account of my marriage and its consequences. Given his acrimonious separation from his wife, Annabella Milbank, this part alone promised to be explosive. Byron died in Greece in 1824. News of his death reached London, and so did the manuscript of his memoirs. A small group of his closest friends and representatives, including Thomas More, his publisher John Murray, his friend John Cam Hobhouse, and representatives of his estranged wife and half-sister Augusta Lee, with whom he was rumored to have had an incestuous affair, gathered at Murray's office. What happened next is an infamous act of literary destruction. Despite Moore's initial desire to see the memoirs published, he had even received money for them, the group, fearing the damage the candid account would do to Byron's reputation and, more pressingly, to the reputations of those still living, especially Augusta Lee and Lady Byron, decided the manuscript had to be destroyed. On May 17, 1824, in the fireplace of John Murray's office at 50 Albemarle Street, the 2 volumes of Lord Byron's unsparing self-portrait were torn up and fed to the flames. Only 2 or 3 people had read them. What exactly was in those pages? We can only speculate based on Byron's life and letters, details of his numerous love affairs, his unvarnished thoughts on his contemporaries, confessions, scandals, perhaps even poetic insights. The burning of Byron's memoirs represents a deliberate act of censorship by those closest to him, aimed at protecting reputations, but robbing posterity of what would undoubtedly have been one of the most sensational and revealing autobiographies ever written. The intimate thoughts of one of literature's most compelling figures went up in smoke. Number 5. The Lost Chapters of Roman Glory and Decay. Livy's History. Titus Livius, known as Livy, was a Roman historian who lived from 59 BC to 17 AD. He undertook a monumental task to write a complete history of Rome from its legendary founding, traditionally 753 BC, up to his own time, the reign of Augustus. He titled this massive work, Aburbor Condita Libri, Books from the Founding of the City. It originally comprised an astonishing 142 books, or scrolls. Livy's history was celebrated in his own time for its vivid narrative style, its patriotic fervor, and its moral lessons drawn from Rome's past. It became a standard historical text, shaping how Romans understood their own identity in history for centuries. It covered legendary beginnings, the rise of the Republic, the Punic Wars, the Civil Wars, and the emergence of Augustus as the first Roman emperor. Here's the tragedy. Of those 142 books, only 35 have survived intact. These are books 1 to 10, covering the period from Rome's founding to 293 BC, and books 21 to 45, covering the Second Punic War with Hannibal from 218 BC down to 167 BC. That means 107 books are lost. What's in those missing volumes? So much crucial Roman history. The lost books detailed the Gracchi brothers' reforms, the rise of Marius and Sulla, the slave revolt led by Spartacus, the careers of Pompey and Julius Caesar, Caesar's assassination, the subsequent civil wars between Octavian, Augustus, and Mark Antony, and the entirety of Augustus's long and good reign, right up to the death of his stepson Drusus in 9 BC. These are some of the most pivotal and dramatic periods in Roman and indeed world history. We aren't completely in the dark about their contents. We have Pherecydes, which are very brief, summaries or epitomes of all 142 books, likely compiled a few centuries after Livy. We also have fragments and passages quoted by other ancient authors. These summaries give us a skeleton, but they lack the rich detail, the character portrayals, the speeches, and the narrative artistry of Livy's original prose. Imagine having Livy's full account of Julius Caesar's campaigns and assassination, or his contemporary perspective on the rise of Augustus. The loss of the majority of Ob Urbo Condita is like having a grand, epic film series where most of the middle and concluding reels are missing, leaving us with only the beginning, a chunk of the middle, and a summary of the rest. It's a colossal gap in our understanding of Rome, as told by one of its most celebrated historians. Number 4. The Catalogue of All Knowledge. Callimachus's Pinax. The Library of Alexandria in Egypt, founded in the early 3rd century BC, was one of the largest and most significant libraries of the ancient world, aimed to collect all of human knowledge. But how do you find anything in a collection of potentially hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls? You need a catalog. And that's where Callimachus and his Pinax come in. Callimachus of Cyrene, HC 310, etc., 240 BC, was a renowned poet, critic, and scholar who worked at the Library of Alexandria. He undertook the monumental task of creating a comprehensive catalogue of the library's holdings. This work was called the Pinax, which translates to tables or tablets. It wasn't just a simple list of titles. It was a pioneering work of bibliography and literary history. Pinax reportedly consisted of 120 books, or scrolls itself. For each author, Callimachus aimed to provide a short biography, a list of their works, and often the first line of each work to help with identification. As titles weren't always standardized, he organized the entries by genre, and then alphabetically by author. The main genres included rhetoric, law, epic, poetry, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, mathematics, and natural science. This was a revolutionary achievement. Pinax essentially provided a map to Greek literature up to that point. Its standardized author attributions helped to identify different versions of texts and preserved information about countless works, many of which are now lost. It was the first large-scale, systematic attempt to organize and document a vast body of literary material. Tragically, like most of the texts it cataloged, the Pinax itself is now lost. We know about it through references and quotations by later ancient writers. Its disappearance means we've lost not only a guide to the lost treasures of the Library of Alexandria, but also a foundational work of scholarship. Imagine what the Pinax could tell us about authors whose names are now barely known, or about the full extent of famous authors. Its influence, however, persisted. Principles of bibliographic organization established by Callimachus shaped cataloging practices for centuries and are, in a sense, ancestors of modern library systems and literary encyclopedias. But the original Pinax, with its detailed entries on countless lost Greek texts, remains an exceptionally lamented loss, a lost key to a lost world of knowledge. Number 3. The original epic of belly laughs, Homer's Margites. Homer, the legendary ancient Greek poet, is synonymous with epic poetry. His Iliad and Odyssey are cornerstones of Western literature. Grand tales of war, heroes, gods, and adventure. But ancient tradition attributed another very different epic poem to Homer, the Margites. And this one was apparently a comedy. The Margites, believed to have been composed perhaps as early as the 8th or 7th century BC, told the story of its titular character, Margites. Unlike the heroic figures of the Iliad and Odyssey, Margites was a fool, a sort of anti-hero. The name itself suggests mad or lustful. A famous surviving line, quoted by Plato and Aristotle, says of him, "He knew many things, but he knew them all badly." Another fragment suggests he couldn't even count to 5 and didn't know which of his parents had given birth to him. This poem was apparently quite popular in antiquity. Aristotle, in his Poetics, the surviving first book, considered the Margites a foundational work of comedy, just as the Iliad and Odyssey were for tragedy. He praised it for being the first work to outline the forms of the ridiculous in a dramatic way, rather than just through personal invective. This suggests the Margites might have been a proto-comic epic, using epic verse and structure but for humorous effect, parodying the grand style. Imagine a Homeric epic that made you laugh out loud, full of slapstick misunderstandings and the misadventures of an utter simpleton. It could have been a long narrative poem detailing Margites' bumbling attempts at various tasks, his absurd pronouncements, and his general incompetence in all aspects of life. It would have provided a fascinating counterpoint to the serious epics, showing another side of early Greek literary imagination. Unfortunately, the Margites is almost entirely lost. Only a handful of lines and a few testimonia, references by other ancient authors, survive. We have no clear idea of its plot, its length, or the full range of its humor. Its disappearance is a major loss for understanding the origins and early development of Greek comedy and satire. What if this comic Homer had survived alongside the serious Homer? How would it have shaped our perception of Homer himself and the trajectory of comic literature in the West? The Margites remains a ghostly reminder that even the greatest and most foundational authors can have entire influential works vanish into the mists of time, leaving behind just a few tantalizing punchlines. Number 2. The Holy Scripture that disappeared. The Book of the Wars of the Lord. Deep within the pages of the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 14 to be precise, there's a curious and intriguing reference to another now unknown text. As the Israelites are journeying through the wilderness, the narrative mentions a location and then states, "Therefore, it is said in the book of the wars of the Lord." One brief mention, a tantalizing citation of a work that seems to have been known and considered authoritative enough to be quoted in what would become sacred scripture. But what was this book of the wars of the Lord? Sefer Milchemot YHWH in Hebrew. No copy of it has ever been found. It is completely lost to us, aside from this single enigmatic reference. Scholars have speculated extensively about its nature and contents. Given its title, it was likely a collection of ancient Israelite poems, songs, or prose narratives celebrating God's victories on behalf of His people. It might have chronicled key battles, divine interventions, and heroic deeds from the early period of Israel's history, perhaps from the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, or the period of the Judges. Was it an epic poem? A collection of war hymns? A historical chronicle? Its style, judging from the brief quote in Numbers, seems to have been poetic and archaic. Could have been an early source document that later biblical writers drew upon, similar to how the authors of Kings and Chronicles refer to other, now mostly lost, royal annals, like the Book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, or the Book of the Annals of Solomon. The fact that it's quoted in the Torah, the most sacred part of the Hebrew Bible, suggests it was a significant and respected work in its time. Disappearance raises many questions. When was it lost? Why was it not preserved, if it was considered important enough to quote? Did its contents get absorbed into other biblical books, making the original redundant? Or was it simply a victim of the same processes of decay and destruction that claimed so many other ancient texts? The loss of the Book of the Wars of the Lord means we are missing a piece of the literary and historical puzzle of ancient Israel. It could have provided invaluable insights into early Israelite religion, their understanding of God's role in warfare, their historical memory, and their poetic traditions. It's a ghost text, a holy book mentioned within another holy book that has vanished, leaving only its evocative title and a single cryptic verse as testament to its existence. Number 1. The uncopied Colossus, the original Youngli Encyclopedia. Imagine an encyclopedia so vast, so ambitious, that it aimed to preserve all significant Chinese texts and knowledge up to its time. This was the Yongle Dadian, or Great Canon of the Young Era, commissioned by the Young Emperor of China's Ming Dynasty in 1403. It was quite simply the largest encyclopedia ever compiled for nearly 600 years. A team of over 2,000 scholars worked for 4 years, from 1403 to 1407, some sources say 1408, to complete this monumental project. They scoured existing libraries and archives, transcribing entire books and excerpts on every conceivable subject: philosophy, history, art, literature, science, technology, medicine, agriculture, religion, drama, and more. It wasn't just summaries. It included complete texts of many works that were already rare. The final encyclopedia was colossal. Consisted of 22,937 manuscript rolls or chapters, bound into 11,095 volumes. It contained an estimated 370 million Chinese characters. To put that in perspective, it was many times larger than the famous Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert from 18th century France. When completed, it was too massive to be printed using the woodblock printing technology of the time. The cost and labor would have been prohibitive. So, only one primary manuscript was made. This original manuscript was likely stored in Nanjing and then moved to the Forbidden City in Beijing. Recognizing its immense value and the risk of having only one copy, Emperor Jiayijing ordered a handwritten duplicate to be made in 1557. This copying project took several years. What happened to these two monumental sets? The original 1407 manuscript's fate is a mystery. Some believe it was destroyed in a fire that consumed parts of the Forbidden City in the 17th century, possibly when Nanjing fell to Manchu invaders or during the transition from Ming to Anjin dynasty. Others speculate it might have been hidden and is still waiting to be rediscovered, perhaps even buried with Emperor Jiayijing. The 1560s duplicate manuscript fared little better over time. Volumes were gradually lost, dispersed, or damaged due to neglect, fires, and warfare. The most significant destruction occurred during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, when the Hanlin Academy in Beijing, where much of the encyclopedia was stored, was burned and looted by foreign soldiers and Chinese combatants. Today, fewer than 400 volumes, about 800 chapters, or less than 4% of the total of the duplicate manuscript survive, scattered in libraries and private collections around the world. Each surviving volume is a priceless treasure. The loss of the rest of the Yongle Dadian, and especially the original manuscript, represents an almost unimaginable cultural catastrophe. Countless ancient and medieval Chinese texts preserved within its pages are now lost forever, their wisdom stories and knowledge silenced. It was an attempt to create a library of all libraries, and most of it vanished.